In the dead of winter, 1893, a young girl was found wandering the woods of Breckenridge County, Vermont. She wore nothing but a threadbare nightgown, soaked to the bone and crusted in dried blood. Her feet were bare, her skin pale and bluish from exposure, and in her hands she clutched a bundle of torn lace and teeth. Her name was Eloise Blackthorne, last known heir of the Blackthorne estate, a Gothic manor hidden deep in the northern hollows. She was 11 years old, unable to speak, and covered in bruises that appeared in the shapes of fingers, as if she'd been held down by many hands. The sheriff's report at the time was brief, barely a paragraph. Eloise was incoherent, malnourished, and nonverbal. She was taken to St. Agatha's Hospital in Montpelier. When doctors asked her name, she whispered only once, "They're still singing." The Blackthorne estate, located 2 miles from where she was found, was discovered a day later. Every window was boarded shut from the inside. The front doors were bolted with iron spikes and sealed with candle wax as if in preparation for something unholy. When investigators finally broke in, what they found was chilling. The dining table was fully set. Food, still warm, lay untouched. The fireplace was roaring, casting twisted shadows across walls lined with faded portraits, but not a single soul was inside. 11 family members had been registered as living there. All of them were gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no footprints in or out of the snow. For weeks the local paper speculated on everything from plague to cult suicide to mass kidnapping, but no answers ever came. The Blackthorne case was quietly closed by spring. The estate was boarded up, the girl institutionalized, and Vermont moved on. But the story didn't end there. A century later, sealed court records and long-forgotten psychiatric evaluations began to resurface. Among them, Eloise's therapy sketches, crude drawings of hollow-eyed figures with mouths where their stomachs should be. She drew a tree with human teeth hanging like fruit, and most disturbingly she drew the same phrase again and again in jagged, childlike handwriting: "The choir must eat." This story isn't for the faint-hearted. It isn't for casual listeners or Sunday afternoon curiosity seekers. It's for those willing to stare into the rotten heart of a forgotten American bloodline. For those who understand that sometimes history doesn't just haunt us, it feeds on our silence. So tonight, we open the sealed archive. We step into the darkness of the Blackthorne legacy and ask a question that still terrifies those who remember the girl in the snow. What really happened to the Blackthorne family? Let us know in the comments what state you're listening from, because some say descendants of the Blackthornes still walk among us. And they're still listening, always listening. Breckenridge County was carved into the northeastern corner of Vermont in 1836, stitched together from patches of forest, marsh, and rocky hillside too wild for the surrounding settlements to tame. At first glance, it was a place people passed through, not somewhere they chose to stay. Its soil was too thin, its roads too crude, and its winters too brutal. But for a certain kind of man, that isolation was a gift. One such man was Dr. Ephraim Blackthorne, a Civil War field surgeon born in Massachusetts. Ephraim arrived in Breckenridge in the summer of 1865, shortly after the war's end, accompanied by a small caravan of followers and a dying wife. Locals say his carriage wheels sank into the mud just outside the county line, and instead of pushing forward, he set up camp. Within a year, he had purchased 200 acres of wilderness and begun construction on what would become Blackthorne House, a 3-story stone manor with no clear blueprint and no registered architect. But Dr. Blackthorne wasn't just a physician, he was also a preacher, and his version of salvation was unlike anything the hill folk had ever heard. In his handwritten sermons, some of which still survive in the county archive, Ephraim wrote of a divine plan rooted in biology. He believed the soul was a heritable trait, passed through generations like eye color or bone structure, and that moral decay could be prevented by preserving spiritual lineage. In plain terms, Ephraim believed in blood purity, not just as a pseudoscience, but as a theology. "The womb is the cathedral," he wrote in an 1867 pamphlet titled The Gospel of the Body. From the first breath to the last breath, man must know where his blood comes from, or he becomes dust. Breckenridge, at the time, had no official church. With no competition, Ephraim established his own congregation, a mixture of medicine, Old Testament severity, and whispered ritual. He baptized children using lamb's blood. He treated fevers with bleeding cups and live leeches. He was rumored to perform surgeries in the basement by candlelight, sometimes without the patient's consent. By 1870, the Blackthorne family was one of the wealthiest in the region, yet no one could recall ever seeing them shop in town, attend school, or host visitors. Their wealth came not from farming, but from the sick. Locals desperate for healing came to the estate, but few returned more than once. The ones who did described eerie silence, narrow corridors hung with bones, and the pervasive smell of rot, sweet and cloying, like old fruit and vinegar. But there was something else no one could quite explain: the songs. Travelers who passed through the hollows late at night claimed to hear faint, echoing voices, long, sustained notes like a choir tuning beneath the earth. One lumberjack reported that the air hummed when he stood near the estate's root cellar. Another claimed he found strange carvings on the trees, symbols that resembled human faces fused with animal features. The county, still unincorporated and largely ignored by the state, lacked any formal law enforcement. Complaints died in whispered circles. No arrests were ever made, and Dr. Blackthorne's sermons, once spoken in open fields, moved behind closed doors, then underground entirely. When Ephraim died in 1873, the town expected the strange chapter to close. Instead, it got worse. His son, Silas Blackthorne, inherited not only the estate, but the doctrine. And Silas didn't just believe in blood purity, he enforced it, and Brackenridge would never be the same. Silas Ephraim Blackthorne was born during a thunderstorm in 1854, inside a birthing tent erected beside his father's unfinished manor. According to midwife notes, found decades later in a collapsed barn attic, he was born with the cord wrapped twice around his neck and didn't cry for nearly 3 minutes. When he finally did, the sound was described as not unlike a choir boy's pitch. From his earliest years, Silas was groomed not just as an heir, but as a vessel. His father, Dr. Ephraim Blackthorne, believed the boy to be a pure conduit, a term scribbled repeatedly in his sermons and medical ledgers. Unlike most children, Silas was kept apart from the village children and raised by 3 women known only as the aunts, who were reportedly distant cousins and midwives. They were never photographed. They were never recorded in any census. By the time Silas was 19, he had memorized all of his father's texts and conducted his first spiritual correction, a term used in a recovered Blackthorne family diary to describe procedures performed on children born with what they called divergent vessels. In modern terms, this likely referred to birth defects or mental illness, but within the walls of Blackthorne House, it was seen as divine imperfection, something to be bled out or broken open. Silas's journals, unearthed in a 1952 estate auction and later locked away again by private collectors, detail a mind unraveling in lockstep with its obsession. "The bones must be buried face down," he wrote in one entry from 1878. "The mouths of the dead whisper upwards. Only the chosen may hear." Unlike his father, who kept up appearances as a physician and community member, Silas withdrew completely from the world. The estate's gates were sealed, mirrors were removed from every room, every window was outfitted with iron bars, not to keep people out, but, by all appearances, to keep something in. Those who glimpsed Silas in his adult years described a tall, pale man with unblinking eyes and a perpetual black coat, even in summer. He was known to appear at the edges of funerals, standing silently by trees or grave markers, before disappearing back into the woods. His teachings, passed orally within the family, centered around the belief that the soul could fracture across bloodlines, and that only through controlled breeding and ritual fasting could a lineage remain intact. The doctrine prohibited marriage outside the bloodline and even discouraged contact with non-relatives unless under direct supervision. It was, in every sense, the transformation of the Blackthornes into a closed ecosystem, a cult bound not just by faith, but by DNA. Family trees uncovered by amateur genealogists show suspicious loops, multiple marriages between cousins once or twice removed, and an alarming pattern of premature deaths in infants born outside those carefully arranged pairings. Silas's brother Edwin reportedly tried to leave the family in 1884 after falling in love with a girl from nearby Grafton. Weeks later, the girl's body was discovered in the river, hands bound, mouth sewn shut. No charges were ever filed. Edwin returned home the following month and never left again. In a rare letter sent from Silas to a cousin in Pennsylvania, now preserved in the Vermont Historical Registry, he wrote, "Let the outside world rot. Their bodies are weak because their blood is spoiled. We remain clean. The choir must stay clean." This phrase, the choir, appears again and again across journals, letters, and even etched into the stone of the family's private mausoleum. No one has ever confirmed what, or who, the choir referred to, but what is clear is that under Silas's rule, the Blackthorne estate transformed from a bizarre medical compound into something far more sinister. Worship gave way to sacrifice, sermons gave way to silence, and within the iron-wrapped walls of the manor, generations were born, buried, and erased, never stepping foot beyond the tree line. By 1893, at the time of Eloise's discovery in the woods, Silas was 39 years old. He would never be seen alive again. By the late 1870s, whispers about the Blackthorne family had curdled into fear. Local women, many of them young, poor, or recently orphaned, began disappearing. Most had last been seen near the eastern edge of the forest that bordered the Blackthorne estate. Others were believed to have gone willingly, lured by promises of food, work, or medicine. None were ever seen again. Between 1877 and 1890, 11 women were reported missing in Breckinridge County, nearly all within a 15-mile radius of the estate. The sheriff's department, poorly funded and more interested in avoiding scandal than seeking justice, quietly closed most of the cases, often blaming runaways or harsh weather. But townsfolk knew better, and the midwives knew the most. One of them, a woman named Hester Quinley, now immortalized in town folklore, kept a handwritten journal, recovered years later behind a false wall in her family's farmhouse. In one chilling entry dated April 3, 1886, she wrote, "I helped deliver the last Blackthorne child tonight. It had no eyes, only sealed skin where they should have been. The mother cried. The father prayed. They said it was God's will. I will not return." Multiple entries like this describe horrifying births, children with twisted limbs, teeth already forming along the gums, or tongues that never separated from the roof of the mouth. Stillborns were common. So were disappearances of the mother shortly after giving birth. Some midwives claimed they were told the women left in the night. Others suspected they never left the estate at all. One anonymous letter, sent to the Breckinridge Gazette in 1888 and never published, stated, "There is something in the cellar. They take the ones who bleed easy. The girls, they make them sing." The phrase "make them sing" appears multiple times in various testimonies and fragments. At first it seemed like metaphor, but as more accounts surfaced, the language took on a more literal and disturbing meaning. According to records preserved in the Montpelier Medical Archives, a boy named Emery Hatch was treated in 1891 for a severe anxiety disorder. He was 10 years old, and his father, a lumber worker, claimed Emery saw things while playing near the Blackthorne forest. In his sessions, the boy described seeing women buried up to their necks and long strings of mouths hanging from trees. He mentioned a sound he couldn't forget, a low constant humming like bees, but made of voices. It would be easy to dismiss this as childhood imagination, except for what was found a year later. In the summer of 1892, a group of boys playing near the Blackthorne property uncovered a shallow grave filled with bones. The remains were mostly fragmented, but several female pelvises and jawbones were identified by a local doctor. No official statement was ever made. The bones were never claimed. Rumors persisted that the estate contained a secret birthing chamber carved into the rock below the manor's foundation, stone walls smeared with decades of soot, rusted chains bolted into the floor, bloodstains that couldn't be scrubbed away. No formal investigation ever took place. The land was privately owned, and the Blackthornes were untouchable. Witnesses described seeing pale figures at night, women with long hair and blank expressions, standing just inside the tree line before vanishing into the dark. Some believed these were ghosts, others weren't so sure. Another letter, written by a young seamstress in 1893, just weeks before the fire that would destroy the estate, contains one final disturbing line: "They don't bury their dead, they plant them." What that meant has never been confirmed. But considering what happened next, the fire, the disappearance of the entire Blackthorne family, and the emergence of a blood-covered child from the woods, it raises a question that lingers to this day. Were these women victims of religious madness? Or something even older and deeper? In the spring of 1895, 2 years after the disappearance of the Blackthorne family and the mysterious appearance of Eloise in the snow, the Vermont State Asylum brought in an outsider, a young Boston physician named Dr. Isaac Alcott, fresh out of Harvard Medical School and known for his progressive views on hysteria and trauma. Dr. Alcott was sent to evaluate Eloise Blackthorne, who remained almost entirely nonverbal and unresponsive. She had been under institutional care since the fire, now labeled simply as Subject EB93. At first he believed she was catatonic, but then she began to draw. Dozens of sketches poured from her small hands, crude, frantic illustrations in black pencil and red chalk. One depicted a tree with human mouths instead of leaves. Another showed rows of eyeless children kneeling in a circle, their hands raised to a figure standing at the center, a tall, robed man with a mouth where his stomach should be. Alcott was both disturbed and intrigued. He began documenting every session in a private field journal. That journal, found sealed inside a false panel in the Montpelier Library nearly 80 years later, provides the only first-hand account of Eloise's mental state. One entry, dated June 7, 1895, reads, "She hums now, low and rhythmic, the same 5 notes, always in the same order. I match them to an old ecclesiastical scale, Phrygian mode, ancient, dissonant, unsettling. She draws when she hums. It's as if she's remembering something not through thought, but through sound." On June 15th, Alcott requested access to the Blackthorne estate ruins. The site had been abandoned and partially collapsed, but some of the foundation remained. With a local surveyor, he attempted to map the layout based on recovered blueprints and local accounts. What they found was deeply unsettling. The manor had been built on a limestone ridge, but beneath it was a man-made tunnel system, corridors carved by hand, with markings that matched symbols found in Eloise's drawings. One section had iron rings embedded in the walls, and soot-stained beams suggesting torch usage. The deepest chamber contained a massive stone basin, roughly 6 feet in diameter, blackened and cracked. Dr. Alcott recorded its dimensions and called it the font. His journal described the scene in harrowing detail. The air is cold and sour. The font is empty now, but the inside is stained. There are scratches along the rim, some circular, some look like claw marks. It smells sweet, like rotting fruit and candle wax. 2 days later, Dr. Alcott returned to the asylum. He never filed his official report. Instead, his journal ends abruptly with one final entry: "They see me. I should not have gone below. The choir sings beneath the roots. The stone was never meant to be uncovered. She was the key. She remembers. God help us." He disappeared the following week. The official record lists his cause of death as drowning, his body found in a nearby lake with lungs full of brackish water. But those who knew him said he feared water, never swam, and hadn't been near the lake for years. After his death, Eloise fell completely silent again. Her drawings stopped, her health deteriorated. She died quietly in 1912 at the age of 30. No family claimed the body. Her gravestone reads only E.B., born of silence. The files Dr. Alcott left behind were sealed by the hospital board and locked in storage for nearly a century, until 1987, when a renovation unearthed the hidden journal. Many pages had been torn out. The rest smell faintly of candle wax. In 1973, nearly 80 years after the fire that consumed the Blackthorne estate, a state-funded land survey was ordered to evaluate the viability of repurposing the property into a historic landmark. Locals had long resisted the idea. The land had a reputation. Birds refused to nest there, compasses spun wildly near the foundation, and children who wandered too close often returned crying without knowing why. Still, the state persisted. What the surveyors discovered beneath the soil would never make it into any official report. A team of 3 uncovered what they believed to be an old root cellar, stone steps descending into darkness, hidden beneath a slab of collapsed granite. But as they cleared more debris, they realized it wasn't a cellar. It was an entrance to an extensive underground chamber network, each hallway branching like veins from a central hub. The central chamber was circular and massive, nearly 30 feet in diameter, with stone pillars spaced evenly along the walls. In the center was the font, a stone basin described decades earlier in Dr. Alcott's journals. The structure still stood, its rim cracked and blackened, but this time it wasn't empty. Inside the font were bones, more than a dozen partial skeletons, all arranged in a spiraling pattern. Many were missing their lower jaws. Some had been bound with rusted wire at the wrists and ankles. And most disturbingly, each skull had been pierced through the crown with a long iron nail. DNA analysis, primitive at the time, suggested the remains belonged to women aged 15 to 25. Along the walls were carvings, rows of repeating symbols that matched drawings found in Eloise's psychiatric files. But one phrase was etched more prominently than the rest, running in a circle above the altar, written in archaic Latin, corpus meum, vox mea, cibus eorum, my body, my voice, their feast. The media was never notified. The state survey was quietly canceled, and within 6 months the property was reclassified as environmentally unstable, fenced off, and forgotten again. But by then the story had already begun to leak. One of the surveyors, David Lanning, 32, left the team and began posting anonymously on early conspiracy forums. He shared photos, notes, and recordings taken during the excavation. Most of them were deleted within days. But one recording survived, a short audio clip captured deep in the tunnels. It begins with footsteps and breathing, followed by silence. Then, low, harmonic tones begin to rise. Human voices, layered, slow, unnatural. Not words, just sound. And then, a single child's voice, clear and high, cutting through the chant with a single line. The choir must eat. Paranormal investigators descended on Brackenridge in waves during the late 70 seconds and early 80 seconds. Most left disappointed. Others reported strange experiences, nosebleeds near the tunnel site, electrical equipment failing without cause, or the sensation of pressure in the ears, like being underwater. But one team, led by folklore archivist Marta Bellamy, dug deeper. She uncovered church records from a now-defunct sect known as the Fraternity of the Living Psalms, which briefly operated in rural Vermont during the 1850s. Their doctrine centered around vocal sacrifice, rituals where divine pain could be harmonized into salvation. One sermon fragment reads, "He who sings through flesh unclean must offer the vessel, bleeding and open, to the roots." That the choir may sustain the voice, it wasn't proof, but it was a pattern, and it pointed to something older than the Blackthorns. Something that may have used them as instruments. Back in Brackenridge, a team of private researchers conducted a ground-penetrating radar scan of the lands surrounding the estate ruins in 1989. The scan revealed dozens of subterranean anomalies, symmetrical hollows roughly 6 feet long, laid out in a spiral path extending from the font chamber, not graves, catacombs. A map of the tunnels, released anonymously in 1991, was labeled simply, "The Choir." And at the center of the spiral beneath a chamber never excavated was a sealed vault, 8 feet deep, lined with iron, locked from the inside. No one has opened it. No one has tried. But the question now is no longer what happened to the Blackthorns. It's who did they serve? Because the choir, it seems, was not just a metaphor. It was a living thing, fed not on praise, but on pain. On the night of December 23, 1893, flames lit up the sky above Brackenridge Hollow. Locals described it as a fire that didn't burn like fire, blue at the base, white at the tips, rising in pulsing waves like a breathing thing. The Blackthorn estate, isolated atop its forested ridge, had caught flame just before midnight. By morning, it was ash. But it wasn't the fire that shocked the town. It was what and who wasn't found inside. According to tax records and church registries, 11 members of the Blackthorn family were known to be living in the estate at the time. Not one body was ever recovered. No bones, no remains, nothing. The structure itself had been fortified to absurd degrees, iron bars across every window, stone walls several feet thick, wooden doors reinforced with riveted steel. For a fire to consume it so completely was, as one investigator later wrote, architecturally improbable. Yet it happened, and amid the smoldering ruin, a single figure was spotted just before dawn. A girl, barefoot and blood-stained, stumbling down the snowy road, her eyes glassy and wide. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply held something wrapped in scorched cloth, a rosary twisted and blackened, with a pendant carved into the shape of a mouth. This was Eloise Blackthorne, 11 years old, doctors at St. Agatha's would later document her physical state, severe hypothermia, bruising along the ribs and throat, minor burns on her hands, and signs of long-term malnutrition. But the most disturbing detail was this: her vocal cords were intact, but she did not speak. For nearly 2 years, the only word she ever whispered, weeks later, was singing. Witnesses in the town reported strange phenomena on the night of the fire. Birds flying in disoriented circles, dogs howling for hours, and in one case an entire herd of cattle breaking through a locked fence and fleeing into the woods. One man, a trapper named Gideon Fay, claimed to see figures in the trees, tall, thin, moving in unison without sound. Another resident, schoolteacher Beatrice Wood, wrote in a letter to her sister, "There was no smoke, only light. Blinding. I heard no screams, no cries for help, only humming, deep, like a man's voice in a chapel. But it was coming from the earth. The fire was never investigated by the state. The official cause was listed as spontaneous chimney combustion, a designation so absurd that even the local sheriff refused to sign the report. Within days, the remaining Blackthorne land was sold to the county. The estate was never rebuilt. But strange things continued to happen. Throughout the winter of 1894, 9 different households within 5 miles of the estate reported missing pets. Churchgoers claimed to hear faint voices during silent prayer. A grave in the town cemetery, belonging to Ephraim Blackthorne, was found unearthed, the casket empty. And most chilling of all, in March of that year, a local child named Thomas Yule went missing for 2 days. When he returned, barefoot and shivering, he told his mother, "They made me sing, down there." But I didn't know the words. He refused to go near the woods again. To this day, no official account exists of what caused the fire, who survived, or what, if anything, remains beneath the ruins. But for those who still live near Brackenridge Hollow, one belief persists. The fire didn't destroy the Blackthornes, it freed them. And the choir? It's still hungry. Over a century has passed since the Blackthorne estate vanished into fire and legend. The land remains untouched, frozen in time, overgrown with tangled roots and rusting iron. No official memorial stands. No historical marker acknowledges what happened. Yet the story persists, passed between generations in Brackenridge County like a whispered warning, don't follow the singing. What the Blackthornes left behind isn't just ash and mystery. It's a lingering sickness, embedded in the bones of the forest and the silence of those who remember. Town records still show gaps, unregistered births, unclaimed deaths, and a population dip that lasted nearly 20 years after the fire. Families moved away without explanation. Whole bloodlines vanished. But for those who stayed, there were signs that the Blackthornes never truly left. In 1932, a school was built 2 miles from the original estate site. Construction halted 3 times due to unexplained accidents, tools going missing, scaffolding collapsing, and one worker claiming he heard a girl humming underground. That school was eventually completed and closed just 4 years later, after a rash of night terrors among the children and the disappearance of a janitor named Harold Vexley. In 1964, a genealogy student from Boston traced a distant line of the Blackthorne bloodline to a family living quietly in northern Maine. She interviewed them for her thesis, Forgotten American Lineages. Her notes, recovered after her own mysterious disappearance, included a single disturbing passage. They keep mirrors covered. They don't allow singing after dark. One child, aged 10, spoke to me in Latin and said, "The font is not empty." And in 2009, during a cold autumn rain, a group of amateur urban explorers broke into the sealed Blackthorne tunnels. Only 2 made it out. Their footage, though never officially released, was circulated briefly online before being scrubbed. One frame shows what appears to be a long, dark corridor, lined not with stone or dirt, but with teeth, embedded like tiles into the wall. The clip ends with the same 5-note sequence Eloise was said to hum in her final days. There are things that cling to blood. There are voices that don't fade with time. And there are families whose secrets are too tightly wound into their marrow to ever truly die. The Blackthornes were not just a strange, isolated family. They were something else entirely, a vessel, a ritual, a warning, and perhaps most terrifyingly, a seed, one that may have spread farther than anyone realizes. So we ask you, where are you watching from? Have you heard of families like this in your region? Do your towns have names whispered in fear, ruins no one dares to rebuild, or songs no one teaches anymore? Let us know in the comments. And if you feel the hum, if you hear the choir, don't sing back.